This diagram represents something D&D related. Is it how often your players ask you if they can use a homebrewed character class versus the number of times you say yes? It could be, but not quite. Or is it the amount of time it takes to schedule the next session versus how long it should take? Well, that could be true as well, but nope. This diagram shows how much of the rules in the core 5e rulebooks are dedicated to running combat. And if you say that can't be true, you might be right. This is just my estimation based on a quick skim through the rulebooks and, well, my general experience playing as a DM. When so much of the game is centered around combat, it goes without saying that we want combat to be as fun as possible. Because if combat isn't fun, why even play Dungeons & Dragons? Sure, you may have some players that are more interested in recreating their own Vex and Percy romance than in playing Dungeons & Dragons, but if that's the case, you really can find RPG systems that are much more suited for that sort of thing than Dungeons & Dragons, because at its core, Dungeons & Dragons is a combat tabletop role-playing game. It is its main feature. It's what most of the game is dedicated towards. So why is it that 5e combat can so often feel like a chore, something that just drags out or is underwhelming, something that just isn't fun? Well, in my experience, there are 5 key reasons for this. 1, it's pointless. 2, it's slow. 3, it's predictable. 4, it's bland. And 5, it's unbalanced. These are the 5 main reasons, in my experience, that your 5e combat sucks. So in this series, I'll cover these 5 points and help you make sure that your 5e combat is meaningful, it's fast, it's exciting, engaging, and better balanced. And we're going to start right now by talking about why your combat sucks when it's meaningless and how to give it meaning so you can make sure that there's a point to it. There's nothing that will kill a person's will to fight faster than realizing that the fighting is pointless. And that's not just an issue for army generals, it's also an issue for DMs. Because if the players don't feel like the combat or the decisions in combat actually matter, they're just not going to have fun. It's just not going to be interesting. It all boils down to stakes. If there's nothing at stake, whether that's the dragon's treasure or the characters' lives, there's nothing really to fight for. So how do we raise the stakes? There are many ways we can do this, but we'll start with the most simple and straightforward, and that is by making the combat more deadly. Because there's nothing players value more than the characters' lives, except of course their dice and their miniatures and all that, but you know what I mean. The characters' lives are obviously important, so if the combat is deadly, it's gonna have higher stakes and it's gonna be more interesting. The issue here is that we can't make every combat a harrowing life or death experience, both because that makes the boss encounter that's supposed to be really difficult relatively bland compared to all the other deadly and difficult encounters the characters have, and also because if every encounter is super deadly, you're gonna have super dead characters and the players end up not getting so attached to the characters because they're just gonna die in a session or two, and then you're losing your stakes again because characters are dying left and right, so losing a character isn't all that big of a deal. So while it can be a good idea to make your encounters a bit more difficult, make sure that they're not too easy. You don't want to have every encounter be a deadly encounter. Another obvious thing we could put at stake is the character's resources, whether that's their hit points, their spell slots, their class features, their items themselves. Resources only matter, however, if the characters are going to need them. If they don't have any other encounters that day and they know they're not going to have any more encounters that day, they're not going to really care about losing some of their resources in a battle that isn't deathly or very difficult. And those are typically the encounters that are the least interesting, and that's why a random encounter against a few wolves you meet on the way to a dungeon where you're gonna have a long rest before that dungeon, those encounters just feel so pointless, so meaningless, and don't really matter at all. So that's a good thing to remember. If you don't want to make your encounters straight up deadly, and every random road encounter probably shouldn't be really deadly, make sure that the characters are gonna use those resources or have a need for those resources that they're going to spend in an encounter later in the same adventuring day or before they can replenish them with a long rest. That of course could mean chaining together encounters, putting one encounter after another, so you have 3 random road encounters in a day, but that can also come with its own issues because you end up spending your whole session just on the road fighting random creatures instead of going to the places that are actually fun and having the encounters that actually advance the story. So while it can be a solution to make combat feel meaningful, it's also not a perfect solution that we can use every single time. Sometimes the characters are going to have isolated encounters that are not supposed to be deadly. So what do we do with those? Well, if we're a bit creative, there's actually a ton of ways that we can make sure that every encounter has something at stake that isn't necessarily the characters' lives or their resources. For example, killing a trio of goblins is not going to be a huge deal for a party of 3rd level adventurers. That's not going to be a very exciting combat or encounter, but if they have to kill those 3 goblins before one of the goblins makes its way down the hallway to alert the rest of the dungeon cave complex, well, that's suddenly an interesting combat because there's something at stake here. And while a single troll is probably not going to be a big issue for a party of 5th level characters, killing that troll while the mayor's house with the mayor's children and the mayor's wife inside is burning because someone tried to light the troll on fire, and you have to go either save those kids or kill the troll, then there's suddenly something at stake because there's innocent lives here, and maybe the mayor will have a reward if you save his family from this burning house, and so on. We've added some stakes that aren't really the characters or the resources, but stakes that will feel like they matter in the moment, that make the combat more exciting. We can also raise the stakes by adding in monsters that don't necessarily threaten the characters' lives straight on, but will have other impacts on the character's most beloved possessions. That could be a rust monster that threatens to take away the paladin's armor and make those 1500 gold pieces a complete waste, or it could be something like a spell-eating ghoul that will devour the wizard's spell slots or even reduce their intelligence permanently. Those sort of monsters can be used in encounters that are not deadly, but that will still make the characters feel like there's something real at stake. When you add in stakes like these, it's important to note that you should make sure that the stakes are dependent on how the combat goes and that the characters know that there is something at stake. If the characters don't know that they're going to get a reward from the king if they can save his prized white stallion before it's murdered by the zombies, or they realize that the stallion is going to survive regardless of how fast they kill the zombies, well, then there's nothing really at stake. Still, you can run down this list to determine whether or not your combat is meaningless. 1. Is it dangerous enough to threaten the characters' lives? 2. Is it going to cost them resources they might need later? Or 3. Is there something else at stake, such as other creatures' lives, the character's reputation, or valuable treasure that is dependent on how they do in combat? If you can't make the answer to any of these questions yes, then I have a very simple piece of advice for you, and that is skip it. Yes, I said it, skip it. If you can't make the aforementioned random wolf encounter deadly or happen before other encounters where the resources spent might come in handy, or there's someone else's lives at stake or the character's reputation, if there's nothing at stake here, you're better off simply skipping that random encounter. And that can mean simply not mentioning that there is an encounter, just not doing it, or it can mean saying you met some wolves on the road, you quickly chased them off or defeated them, but otherwise just not spending any time on it because it's pointless, so why spend time on it? But what do you do if you realize that an encounter has become pointless while you're already in it? Let's say, for example, that the cleric turned the 20 zombies into frightened meat puppets that are just going to stand around and wait for the characters to chase them down and hit them over the head until they're dead. Something that could take maybe 10, 15, even 20 minutes. The encounter is basically, for all intents and purposes, already over. What you want to do here is, well, make it over. Just say, you chase down the rest of the zombies and you destroy them all. And one player is going to say, well, I want to know how many I killed. Okay, roll a d6. You killed 5 zombies. Great job. We're done. Let's move on to the rest of the dungeon where there's actually fun stuff. And the same goes for a boss encounter where you maybe had 5 rounds that were really, really fun and really tense, and the ogre mage were just about to win, but then the tides turned, the characters managed to defeat its lieutenants, and now they're just hammering down on the ogre mage that has no more spell slots left. It's okay to just remove the 0 at the end of the ogre mage's hit points, and it will go down in 1 round instead of 4 rounds, and everyone will be just much more satisfied for it. And that wraps up the advice I have for making sure that your D&D combat isn't pointless. Add stakes to combat by making it more dangerous, by making lost resources matter, or by adding alternative stakes such as other creatures' lives, treasure, or whatever else you can come up with. And if you can't do that, or the stakes disappear along the way, skip or end the encounter so you can spend your time on stuff that's actually meaningful. Do you have any examples of a combat being pointless, or a combat being pointless but you made sure that it had meaning and actually gave it meaning? Or do you have any other tips for giving combat encounters in 5e meaning? Please let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from all of you. Thank you so much for watching, and an extra big thank you to our Legend tier patrons who should be popping up on screen right now. And if you want to become a patron, support the channel, and also get a lot of new 5e content and access to a huge archive of 5e content, well, there's a link to that in the description down below. You'll also find a link to our current Kickstarter, or if you're watching this from the future, our past Kickstarter, our book, basically, Heretics Guide to Devotion and Divinity. There'll be a link to that in the description down below as well. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot left to say, except thank you so much for watching, and I hope that I'll see you in the next video.